Saurabh, Saurabh, I'm live now. Share.
लिंक तो हाँ अभी तो कोई पहुंचा ही नहीं होगा
Uh, I am live now. There was some technical issue. there was some technical issue owing to that I was not able to get live. I suppose that I have created a new feed, and after that there will not be any problem, and I am live now. Uh, there were a lot of technological issues. That is why I was not able to connect. And I suppose that now these issues is resolved, and now I am audible. to everybody. Uh, First of all, I would like to thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. N. Panchanatham sir, Registrar Dr. V. Balakrishnan sir, Controller of Examination Professor M. Govindan sir, and my dear friend and coordinator of this webinar, Dr. P. N. Lakshmi, who is also coordinating this webinar. All the participants who are involved in this webinar. I welcome them in this webinar. I welcome them, and I thank everybody for taking the opportunity to discuss the issue that what is the role of stories in communicative English. We know well that nowadays it is necessary to be able to speak English because this language is getting more and more importance, and it is the basis of our international communication. So students have to learn as early as possible to have a strong command of this language and to use it effectively. The language learner has to identify him with that language so that he can apply his knowledge without any fear and uncertainty. And it is important that the teacher applies grammar based exercises as an integral part of real life tasks. Otherwise, what I feel that the learners could get bored, deterred, or even sometimes overtaxed with grammatical units. And that is why there is a need of stories so that we can make our classes more interesting and more grasping for students. We know well that to impart knowledge, it is always necessary to practice one's productive and receptive skills. And storytelling is a very good approach to get in contact with communicative skills. The opinion that storytelling is anything but not communicative is not very convincing. Various scholars claim that storytelling is not communicative because somebody tells a story and nobody is there to interact with that. But it is not very convincing because there are many different possibilities to create a storytelling lesson that can be for all intents and purposes communicative, especially for second language learners. We know that if you come from a Tamil background, your mother tongue is Tamil, then it is but natural that Tamil is your first language, and English will be learned as a second language. Human beings love stories and like to use their imagination in every way they can. Stories can represent other cultures so that nobody could get to know different conventions and patterns of life, or they can present spatial complex problem in which a protagonist or a character tries to cope with a certain situation. Sharing and creating a common experience in storytelling aids in the development of human beings' ability to interpret events beyond his immediate experience. They can learn how to master problems or how to evade them. Storytelling is an art. It is not a process, or it is not a method, or it is not a technique, in my opinion. Storytelling is described as an art. The art of storytelling, and like art, it requires creativity, vision, skill, moreover, practice. We need all these things while we are a storyteller. Storytelling is not something you can grasp in one sitting after one course. It is not like that. It is a trial and error process of mastery. It is hard to pinpoint exactly when it started, although we could say that when man first began to communicate, storytelling maybe started on that time. Storytelling is the original form of teaching. Our ancestors shared their own experiences, customs, and traditions with following generations, above all through oral verbal narration, which truly served as the basic foundation of storytelling. The art of storytelling was passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth in a rich array of ways. A way of doing this was folk tales and fables. These are among the oldest forms by which cultural values, cultural beliefs, moreover, customs and wisdoms have become inculcated in us today. And it is stories through which we have learned various things in our life. People have always told stories. We teachers, we learners, we students, we as a mother, as a father, we keep on telling stories to our kids, to our students, to our friends, to our relatives. So we can say that it have always means been a part of our culture. Storytelling is like preserving history, traditions, and so on. Storytelling were used for different purposes. Storytelling may be taken as means for sharing and interpreting experiences. Stories are universal in that they can bridge cultural, linguistic, and age-related divides. Storytelling can be adaptive for all ages, leaving out the notion of age segregation. Storytelling can be used as a method to teach ethics, values, and cultural norms and differences. Learning is most effective when it takes place in social environments that provide authentic social cues about how knowledge is to be applied. Stories function as a tool to pass on knowledge in a social context. Here, I would like to tell you that there has been a great network. The name of that network is the National Storytelling Network, and it defines storytelling as an ancient art form and a valuable form of human expression, because story is essential to so many art forms. However, the word storytelling is often used in many ways. Telling stories is one of the most powerful means that anybody have to influence, anybody has to teach, inspire. Now, the question comes to our mind, yeah, the question arises that what makes storytelling so effective for learning English, or for communicating in English, or for learning to communicate in English? For beginners, storytelling builds connections among people and between people and ideas. We know well that stories convey the culture, history, and values that unite people. When it comes to our country, our communities, and our families, we simply understand intuitively that the stories we hold in common are an important part of the ties that bind our families, that bind our communities, that binds our country, that binds our culture. As long as there have been people, there have been stories. If there are people, then there are bound to be stories. From the stories told in paintings on the ancient caves to the bedtime stories told to young learner or student, stories make up our history and guide our future. We are actually surrounded by stories every day. The news on television, radio, or in newspaper is nothing but stories. In our Indian culture, we see that Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Bible, and other religious books are full of stories. In these books, there are Any narrative is being shaped with the help of stories. And the lessons teachers give in schools are also often stories. When we communicate with our students, we communicate in a form of story. If we are communicating in a form of story, then we are doing a great job because we are creating or we are arousing interest among our students. And by that way, we are creating interest among students. So each and every teacher who teaches in his classroom creates a story. Even songs tells us stories. When we songs has also some form of stories. Pictures tell us stories. Movies tell us stories. Even the comedians make up their routine with stories. When you talk to a friend, when you tell something to a friend, or when you tell something about your friend that happened to you, you are telling a story. Can you think of the last story you have heard? Think hard. It may be something you just heard a few minutes ago. Some stories have lasted hundreds and even thousands of years and are still being told. Stories began with the oral tradition, meaning they were passed on by being heard and retold. Stories are a part of our everyday culture. Stories about our country and its history, about our states and about our culture. It helps us feel proud of our state, of our nation, of our language, and of our everything. Stories about our ancestors teach us about where we came from and the things we have in common with other people around us. Later, people began to write the stories down, but we still love to hear stories told out loud. What I mean to say here that stories are powerful. They can teach morals, the values the values that the author of the story thinks people should live by. They can teach history, they can entertain us, they can make us think about things in ways we have never thought of them before. They can make us laugh, they can make us cry. Telling stories is a large part of what makes people connected to each other. You probably have favorite stories of your own. Maybe there are stories about your family that you hear from your grandparents, from your parents, from your mother, from your father. Maybe there are books you read over and over. Sometimes we say that I have seen this movie 10 times. Or we say that we usually are in practice of saying that I have read this story 10 times. Then there will be your favorite story. There are your favorite books you read over and over. What is your favorite story? You think of that. And if we talk about stories, there are multiple types of stories, there are various types of stories. Some types of stories are myths, legends, and fables, sometimes folk tales, fairy tales, tall tales. These all are stories. What is a myth? Myth is a type of story that explains a natural occurrence, such as where the sky come from, where this earth came from. Characters in these stories are often supernatural beings like gods, such as Nataraj, such as Minakshi, such as Tirupati, such as Rameshwaram. These type of stories, if these characters are involved in some stories, then we suppose that it is a myth, and the type of stories becomes a myth type of story. There is a legend also, legend type of stories. A legend type of story about a it is about a popular figure that may have never existed but is based on some truth. There are folk tales or fairy tales. Folk tales and fairy tales are old stories that have been around for many years. These stories often begin with once upon a time there was a king. Once upon a time there was a lion in a forest. We start these folk tales and fairy tales in this manner, and many different cultures have their own folk tales or versions of them. If we talk about British culture, we know about Cinderella, story of Cinderella. These type of stories come under folk tales and fairy tales. There are stories of tall tales. A tall tale is a story that's based on truth, but with exaggerations. There are a blending of exaggerations in tall tale stories. Unlike legends, these stories may be based on real people, but the events in the stories may have never happened. There are different type of stories which comes or which falls under the category of tall tale stories. What I mean to say that if you are reading a story, then a good story encourages us to turn the next page and read more and more. We want to find out what happens next, what the main characters do, and what they say to each other. Different emotions runs through while reading or listening to a story. We may feel excited, we may feel sad, we may feel afraid, we may feel angry, or we are really happy. If we read or we listen to a story, these type of emotions are bound to come on the floor. And this is because the experience of reading or listening to a story is much more likely to make us feel that we are part of story too. Just like in our real lives, we might love or hate different characters in the story, and perhaps we recognize ourselves or others in some of them. Perhaps we have similar problems. This is also called, in the language of literature, we call it the generalization of our heart. When we see that of our heart, when we see that King Rama is going to the forest, then we also start feeling the pain of Rama, and this manner we connect our hearts to King Rama. And because of this natural, it is not sympathy, it is a natural empathy. And because of this natural empathy with the characters, our brains process the reading of stories differently from the way we read factual information. Our brain don't always recognize the difference between an imagined situation and a real one. So the characters become alive to us. What they say and do is therefore more meaningful. It becomes more meaningful. This is why the words and structures that relate to story events, descriptions, and conversations are processed in this deeper manner, in this deeper way. In fact, cultures all around the world have always used storytelling to pass knowledge from one generation to another. Our ancestors understood very well that this was the best way to make sure our histories and information about how to relate to others and to our world was not only understood but remembered too. It was not only understood, we always remembered that. Here, kindly let me take liberty to say you that notice the word history. History contains the word story, and more accurately, the word story derives from history. Now, I will be telling you about the characteristics of good stories so that You can easily identify the stories to read and listen for development of communication skill. The first characteristics of a story is that often great stories are universal. Great storytelling is about taking a piece of the human condition, so things like birth, like growth, emotionality, aspirations, conflict, and conveying it in a unique situation. Good stories do the job of connecting learners. Good stories do more than create a sense of connection. They build familiarity and trust and allow the listener to enter the story where they are, making them more open to learning. Good stories can contain multiple meanings, so they are surprisingly economical in conveying complex ideas in graspable manner, in graspable ways. And stories are more engaging than a dry recitation of data points or a discussion of abstract ideas. And that is why say that is why we keep on saying, I personally keep on saying, and I have a different opinion than other people, that stories are not interactive. In my opinion, storytelling is always interactive. The only thing is that how you are using storytelling in the classroom or in a real life scenario. Storytelling involves a two-way interaction between a storyteller and one or more listeners. The responses of the listeners influence the telling of story. In fact, storytelling emerges from the interaction and cooperative and coordinating efforts of teller and audience. In particular, storytelling does not create an imaginary barrier between the speaker and the listener. This is the part of what distinguishes storytelling from the forms of theater that use an imaginary fourth wall. Different cultures and situations create different expectations for the exact roles of storyteller and listener, who speaks, how often, and when, for example, and therefore create different forms of interaction. And the interactive nature of storytelling partially accounts for its immediacy and impact. And its best storytelling can directly and tightly connect the teller and audience. Storytelling uses words, and storytelling, we use the words to create effect upon the listener. And storytelling uses language, whether it be a spoken language or it is a manual language. It is not that only storytelling is done by speaking or producing the sound. There are examples like American Sign Languages, like British Sign Languages, like Indian Sign Languages, in which by the use of signs we create stories, we communicate stories. And the use of language distinguishes, differentiates storytelling from most forms of dance and different expression of arts. It is not that only storytelling uses words. Storytelling uses words, and along with those words, it may use signs to communicate it effectively. Storytelling uses actions such as vocalization, such as physical movement, such as gestures. And these actions are the parts of spoken or manual language other than words. Their use distinguishes storytelling from writing and text based computer interaction, Not all non-verbal language behaviors need to be present in storytelling. Some storytellers use body movement extensively, for example, whereas others use little, or sometimes some storytellers they do not use their body language. So it depends upon the storyteller that how he is communicating along with their actions and along with their words. In storytelling, we present a story. Storytelling always involves the presentation of a story, a narrative. Many other art forms also present story, but storytelling presents it with the other four components. Every culture has its own definition of story. What is recognized as a story in one situation may not be accepted as on one in another situation. Some situations call for spontaneity and playful digressions. For examples, other call for near exact repetition of a revered text. Art forms such as poetry recitation, and nowadays it has become very popular, stand-up comedy. Sometimes they present stories and sometimes they don't present story. Since they generally involve the other four components, they can be regarded as forms of storytelling when they also present stories. Storytelling encourages the active imagination of the listeners, and this is very important because it is directly related to the creativity of a kid, or creativity of the learner, or the creativity of a student, or a creativity of a teacher. In storytelling, the listener imagines the story. In most traditional theater or in a typical dramatic film, on the other hand, the listener enjoys the illusion that the listener is actually witnessing the character or events described in the story. And the listener's role is to actively create the vivid, multi-sensory image, actions, characters, and events, the reality of the story in his or her mind based on the performance by the teller and on the listener's own past experiences, beliefs, and understandings. The completed story happens in the mind of the listener, a unique and personalized individual. In this manner, we can say that storytelling can be combined with other art forms. The contemporary storytelling movement, which is nowadays very popular, includes the development of ways to combine storytelling with drama, with music, with dance, with comedy, with puppetry, and numerous other forms of expression. Yet, even as it blends imperceptibly into other arts, the essence of storytelling remains recognizable as the intersection of the five components included, which I was mentioning earlier. Storytelling happens in many situations, from kitchen table conversations to religious rituals, from telling in the course of other performance of thousands of paying listeners. There is a academy named HubSpot Academy. Uh, According to this HubSpot Academy's free power of storytelling course, they run a free power of storytelling course. There are three components that makes up a good story. These three components are character, conflict, and resolution. In a story, there is always a character. Every story features at least one character, and this character will be the key to relating your audience back to the story. This component is the bridge between you, the storyteller, and the audience. If your audience can put themselves in your character's shoes, then will be more. Then it will be more likely to follow through with your call to action. Conflict, that's the second characteristics. The conflict is the lesson of how the characters overcomes a challenge. Conflict in your story elicits emotions and connects the audience through relatable experiences. When telling stories, the power lies in what you are conveying and teaching. If there is no conflict in your story, it is likely to be not a story. There is the third characteristics which is called as resolution. Resolution means every good story has a closing, but it does not always have to be a good one. Your story's resolution should wrap up the story, provide context around the characters and conflicts, and leave your audience with a call to action. There are now I will move upon to the different ways you can tell your stories. There are different ways of telling the story, and in this way, communicating well. There is a form of a written story, there is a form of a spoken story. Nowadays, an audio story is becoming more and more popular. An audio story, you understand very well that what is a written story and what is a spoken story and what is an audio story. If you do not understand audio story, let me explain you. It is a spoken aloud but a recorded form. That's what set it apart from the spoken story, that it is a recorded form. You can retrieve it, you can listen to it anytime. And it is nowadays the culture of podcast. People are creating their podcast and uploading it to the channels. If you will see my channel, there you may find various podcasts there also. So nowadays the audio stories are becoming more and more popular. There is also a separate form, a digital story. Digital story is told through a variety of media like video, like animation, like interactive stories, and even games. This option is by far the most effective for emotionally resonant stories, as well as active visual stories, which is why it is also the most expensive. But in creating this type of stories, a lot of money is involved in creating a digital story. Now I will move forward and elaborate that how by stories you can develop the four language skill and the fifth language skill also, which I feel that has become quite important nowadays. And for developing the language skills, we should carefully identify the stories as per the level of learner, then utilize it for the purpose. There are many different type of stories. No matter what genre interests you, you can find a short story that will fit your needs. Now, how you can develop the language skills? First of all, I will begin with speaking skill, and later on, I will pass on to listening skill, reading skill, writing skill, and I will finish with the oral interaction skills, which is the core in the communicative English. Because interaction between the two characters is truly the communicative form of English. When you communicate with somebody in English, then it is known as communicating skill. Though the listening, reading, writing, and speaking, these skills are also a part of communicative English. But what I personally feel is that oral interaction skill is also very important, which I'll be discussing in my lecture. You know that most learners, when start to learn a second language, want immediate results, and even after their first lesson, they want to show their friends that they can speak English. It has been proved that students are motivated when they begin to learn a new language. It is important to maintain those high levels of of motivations and a way of achieving it through storytelling. And storytelling can be used in great variety of ways to improve students' oral communication skill. Once they have heard a story, learners are normally anxious to discuss their understanding of the story and relate it to their experiences. And nevertheless, this productive skill can be developed through different speaking activities in the classroom related to the particular story which has been communicated during the class. Any learner need to be given opportunities to speak in English about that particular story as much as possible so they feel that they are making progress. Motivation is crucial when acquiring a second language, and storytelling is a good way of providing those speaking opportunities through different speaking activities. The second skill is listening skill, and storytelling highly contributes in the development of listening and therefore also improves pupil concentration and comprehension skills. While the teachers tells the story in classroom, students have to pay attention to listen the story and understand the meaning of different words, linguistic structures, and so on, in order to comprehend the already developed skills or already developed scenes. The third skill is reading, and the process of comprehension when listening to the spoken word is similar in many respects to understand the written word. There is a important article here. I would like to mention that the title of the article is "The Power of Story." The power of story, using storytelling to improve literary learning. And this essay, this article is written by Sarah Miller and Lisa. They state that storytelling can be used as effective means to increase early literacy and promote reading comprehension skills. So in this way, I can say that we can improve our reading skills also by storytelling approach. And the fourth one is writing skill, which is also it also occupies the central position in our academics, since most of our success is highly dependent upon the writing skill. If you can write better in your examination, you can do better, you can earn better marks, you can do well in the field of academics. When supporting learners or students' writing skills, the teacher should help to make writing purposeful and contextualized wherever possible. And storytelling promotes writing skills by encouraging young people to write their own stories, impressions of stories that they have already heard, or even a play based upon a familiar tale. This skill can can also be developed through writing activities, and their activities which encourages copying and other which encourages creativity. Teachers must always design activities in which creativity is fostered and make students use high order of thinking skills. The fifth skill which I have added in storytelling is oral interaction. First of all, I would like to clarify that speaking skill and oral interaction skills are not the same skills, as they are often being confused. Oral interaction is being able to maintain a conversation. Storytelling contributes in the development of this skill. After telling a story, the teacher normally will ask pupils different questions about it. Pupils then will, students will answer, establishing communication with the teacher, and this manner you will make your storytelling quite interactive. Also, while doing different storytelling activities, pupils might speak to each other, resolving doubts. They also might participate in group activities where they communicate with the teacher, and in this manner, it can go so on. In this manner, we can develop by storytelling. We can develop these four and plus one oral interaction skill, which is going to be very crucial for your development and for developing the communication in English. Now, I think that I would be discussing with you that how to use stories to improve your English and how you can utilize it. Stories are effective to practice all four language learning skill which I have mentioned earlier. You can use stories to enhance your writing skill. I have mentioned it earlier. And what you can more and more do with these skills. I think that if you are telling a story, you are using illustrations to enhance your experiences. Stories available in simplified readers may come with illustrations. If you find a short story with illustration, look at the pictures first to try to guess what the story is telling and what the story is about. And what are they doing in the illustration? What part of the story is illustrated? The illustration will help you to understand the meaning of the story. Try this. When you come across an illustration, write your own caption, create your own caption or description of the picture. It can be a sentence or one word. Write when you see in the image, when you look at the story, go back to your image description. How do they relate? And in this manner, you can also explore stories related to a theme. Like novel stories can be in any genre you can imagine. Do you like a ghost story? Science fiction? You may like a romance story. You can find stories old and new in this genre on the subject that you want. Some stories teach a lesson like fables do. Other stories use a lot of metaphors or symbolism. If you are learning about hobbies, find a short story about something that you can use it, or that you can find a story about something that you like to do. Or you learning about food, find a short story with a lot of food vocabulary. And in this manner, the list goes on. The most important thing is that choose the right reading level. First, some stories are over 5,000 words long, while others can be as short as 50 words. When you are selecting the right story, right short story for you, you have many different types and lengths to choose from. If you choose a story that is too difficult, you will spend too much time going for your dictionary, going after your dictionary, looking up for vocabularies, missing the whole point of story. That will decrease your interest in reading that story. If you choose a story that is too easy, you will learn little to know new vocabulary, and you may become bored by reading those easy stories. As far as the language of that story is concerned, make sure that you always challenge yourself, even if you are only learning a few new words. Easier stories are good practice for vocabulary you already know. Harder stories give you a chance to learn new words while seeing them in the right context or how they are supposed to be used. And in this manner, you can choose a paragraph in the story that you want to read. And by reading that particular paragraph, you can identify that which word is difficult for you, and if the subject interests you, you will be motivated to learn the vocabulary of that particular subject or the particular stories or the particular area. Bring the story to your English teacher or to your among with your colleagues and discuss about those words. And in this manner, you can enjoy a lot. Practice active reading with English stories. What I would suggest, Your reading will only help you to learn if you read it actively. You are reading actively when you are paying very close attention to the story, its words and its meanings. Think about the vocabulary and grammar. Start by looking over the text to get an idea of what the story is about. Finally, review the text again to get the best understanding. You take breaks in between. If your story is longer than 500 words, take break while you are reading that story. Don't make yourself too tired or you will become frustrated and give up. If you find things are getting to be too difficult, walk away for about 15 minutes and come back and try it again. Choose only a few words to look up. If you are able to comprehend the meaning from the sentence, you do not need to go after the dictionary. You don't need to look up every single word you don't know. Choose to look up only those words that will help you understand what the paragraph is about. If there is a word you don't know but you know everything else in the sentence, try to guess the what word is about by looking at the whole sentence. You can look this word up later, see if you guessed correctly. Ask questions, review it. In this manner, I feel that you will be very close to understanding that how you should read the story. And what I suggest that you should review the story also. When you have finished reading the story, review it again. Do this later in the same day or the next day to let your reading really sink in. Take notes. You should take notes while you are reading. If you are finding some sentence structure or some phrase which is new for you, you take a notes and try to use it in your daily communication. And now the question rises how to practice with the stories. I will suggest you that you can go for audio books. Nowadays audio books are becoming quite popular. You can go for podcast and listen to those stories. You can note down the phrases which are new to you, and in this manner you can increase your English vocabulary, as well as you will be able to enhance your phrasal constructions or sentence structure or sentence construction. But the thing is required that you need to find an interesting books. If you are able to find some interesting books, then I suppose that you will be able to arouse your interest in that particular book. You will read that book and you will enjoy that. My suggestion is that when you are starting to read the story, start with the easy one and then move towards the difficult one. For selecting any story, you can join a book club, join other people who are learning English and talk about particular books. This will help you to better understand what you are reading and you will get more practice in speaking of English. It will also hold you accountable to actually read the book. It is quite embarrassing going to a book club and telling people that you haven't read the chosen book. So if you are if you have chosen some book, you will read it at home and then you will go to the club and share with your colleagues. So what I think that you need to do all these exercises, only then you will be able to communicate well. You will be able to utilize these stories for your communicative skills. You can read or listen to stories in sometimes people ask that from where to get a story, from where to get a book. How do I should know that which book is good or which story is book. So I will suggest you that there are various digital platforms where you can find the books, like openthebook.com. It is a very good site. You can go there and you can see. There is also a site named bookbrowse.com. You go there and you can read the sample chapters there. And after reading that sample chapter, if you think that that particular book is good, then you can buy it. So there are a lot of way where you can do these things. And while reading these books, make sure the level is right for you. You need to find a book that is not too difficult but not too easy. First, try reading 2 or 3 pages. If there are more than 10 new words per page, then it may be best to choose a simple book. Reading should not become a boring dictionary exercise. Sometimes people say that you have your story along with you and you put aside your dictionary, and you always try you should always try to write the words which are difficult to you. I will not suggest this to do. You start with the simple one and move towards difficult. If you understand the general meaning and just look up a few new words per page, then the book is probably a good choice for you. Watch the movies. If reading an original novel in English feels a bit scary, try watching the film first. Many popular books now have film versions. For example, you can read Harry Potter. You firstly watch the film, and after that you read that book. Then also it makes you understand the background of the story. You can also try a dual language books. Dual language books has the original English text on one page and translation into your own language, in your Tamil language on the other hand. This means that you can quickly reference your own language if you do not understand all of the English text. You can buy books of this kind in local shops, or there are online market also. Amazon is there, Flipkart is there. You can buy those books from there. There are many more book buying options are present. What you need to do that analyze the language in the book. Always pay attention to how the writer uses the words and constructions in English. Novels and stories, I think that novels and stories both uses some formal and informal English language, and that is you if you come across some new expression, you note it down and try to use it in real life situation. Learn new vocabulary in context of original English books. Think about what you have read. When you have finished your book, take a moment to reflect on what you have read. Were there any words from the book that you specially liked? Note it down. Have you written these down in your notes book or not? Make it sure. If you really enjoy the book, then would you like to try another of the same writers? Because I think that there are writers who uses some particular words in again and again in different stories and novels, and in this way you can have a mastery over that particular words. When you have finished your first novel or a story, it's time to choose the next one. If you are feeling confident, you could try to find a more advanced book. Reading books by the same authors can make life more easier. And what I feel that nowadays it has finally become a very important teaching technique which can develop linguistic skills and also have numerous effective benefits for social and emotional aspect. Stories help anybody to know themselves and to know others so they can with cope with the psychological problems or emotional problems of growing as well as being. You know well about Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire affirms teaching is not just about transferring knowledge, it is about creating the possibility of producing it. And with storytelling, we motivate pupils and give them the opportunity to produce their own knowledge through different meaningful activities and learning situations. Learner or a student learn English through English. It is a way of confirming that language is something to you actually. And in this manner, on the other hand, learner or student love listening to stories again and again, and as a teacher, you should take advantage of this situation. And Finally, I would like to say that storytelling can be fun and can be used with an educational purpose. It all depends upon the teacher and upon the learner, that if he or she is willing to provide pupils the best or not. Storytelling, I suppose that storytelling provides many possibilities. The question here is whether we teachers and we learners are ready to grasp it or not. What is important is that think about what you have read. And in this manner, I think that storytelling, if you are using stories in your communication, if you're reading stories, if you're listening to stories, in my opinion, you can increase your communication skill in a particular language. If you are talking in the context of English, we can use these storytelling methods. We can use reading stories, we can use listening to stories to enhance, to increase our knowledge base. And in this manner, I would like to conclude my lecture. Although there were a lot of technological interventions, and owing to which I was not able to means make it live earlier, but later on, anyhow, with the help of the technical team of my university, I was able to do it live. And in this way, I completed my talk over the role of storytelling in communicative English. I again give thanks to the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Tamil Nadu Teachers Education University, a premier institute in the field of teacher education, Professor Dr. N. Panchanatham sir, Registrar Dr. V. Balakrishnan sir, Controller of Examination Professor M. Govindan sir, all the participants who are involved in this webinar as organizing member, all the people who are involved in making this webinar successful, all the PhD scholars who are involved, and all the dear participants who are always there to learn, to listen, and to also educate me. And at last, but not least, I would like to give thanks to my dear friend Dr. P. N. Lakshmi, who is also the coordinator of this webinar. Thank you for more and more association. And I suppose that in next round we would be discussing about some another aspect communicative English. We may be discussing about writing skill or reading skill in detail. In this manner, I suppose that you might have liked my lecture. I think that if there is a question related to my lecture, you can ask in comment box. I would be the happiest person to answer this. Thank you, goodbye, and take care. Thank you.